You're listening to Paul G's Corner, where history proves that saying it can't happen here usually means it already did. In the spring of 1985, Philadelphia felt tired. Not shocked, not afraid, just exhausted in the specific way a city gets after being argued with for decades. When it realized no one is actually listening, and everyone is just waiting for their turn to be right. Factories were gone and jobs had thinned out, and with them went the margin for error, leaving the city with a quiet irritability. Sirens blended into the background, people skimmed the morning paper, folded the bad news away, and got the kids to school because life always keeps moving. On Osage Avenue, life was small and ordinary. Brick row houses pressed shoulder to shoulder, close enough to share cigarettes, close enough to hear fights that weren't yours. Front stoops doubled as social media. Kids learned early which adults yelled and which ones watched silently and which doors you didn't knock on unless you want trouble. Nothing about the block suggested it would become a symbol, which is usually how these things begin. Because symbols were already on their way, and John Africa believed the city was lying. He was the founder and unquestioned leader of MOVE, a Philadelphia-based communal group that rejected modern technology, private property, and nearly every form of institutional authority. Born Vincent Lepart, he rejected his given name along with nearly everything else modern life had to offer. He spoke in long, winding declarations that mixed grievance, prophecy, and moral certainty, the kind of language that can feel revelatory when you first hear it and suffocating once it hardens. Government is violence. Technology is poison. Compromise is surrender. If it came from the system, John Africa knew it was corrupt by definition. And MOVE was never created to persuade anyone. It was built to be certain. Certain that purity created devotion and community. That purity created devotion and community, a sense of meaning for people who had learned not to trust institutions that rarely protected them. It also created isolation and coercion, where obedience to doctrine mattered more than safety. John Africa's words, recorded in rambling manifestos known as the Guideline, were treated less like conversation and more like gravity, something you oriented yourself around rather than question. You didn't argue with them. You didn't refine them. You followed them. And even after he was in prison following a 1978 Powelton Village standoff, his authority didn't weaken, even though a police officer died that day and MOVE members went to prison, because both sides walked away carrying conclusions they would return to again, not as lessons, but as proof. And Wilson Good found himself waking up every day to the same problem wearing a different suit, each version louder, harder to ignore, and more expensive to leave unresolved. He was not an outside enforcer or a distant authority figure. He was the mayor of Philadelphia, governing a majority black city, confronting a black-led movement that rejected his legitimacy as completely as it rejected the police beneath him. Newly elected in 1984, stepping into an office where power, policing, and public trust had been grinding against each other for decades. He governed under a microscope that never turned off. Every decision landed twice, once as policy, and again as symbol, and not all of them landed the way he expected. He understood distrust of police, but he also knew that if court orders turned into suggestions, the city itself would start testing how much could be ignored without consequence. And eventually, the courts were ignored, noise complaints stacked up, sanitation conditions worsened, and neighbors found themselves worrying less about ideology and more about whether their kids were safe walking past a fortified row house where weapons were known to be stored and no one ever seemed to leave. The meetings repeated themselves and the paper multiplied, and each delay hardened positions rather than softening them. With every missed deadline and ignored order, the cost of backing down grew heavier than the cost of pushing forward, until what had once felt like a judgment call began to feel like motion that no one knew how to stop. By May of 1985, the tension had moved out of the meeting rooms and into bodies, the way people stopped pretending this would resolve cleanly. Osage Avenue knew it before City Hall ever did. The police presence increased. Neighbors packed go bags they didn't think they'd need. People watched the news and felt that familiar tightening in the chest that comes when a situation is clearly headed somewhere bad and no one knows how to stop it. Inside MOVE headquarters, surrender became impossible. Compliance meant admitting the city had been right, and John Africa had built a worldview where being wrong was moral failure. At City Hall, retreat felt equally impossible. Backing down now meant confirming MOVE's claim that authority was hollow. Each side moved forward, convinced that giving ground would cost more than pressing on. And then on May 13th, it began. It began with police surrounding Osage Avenue. Loudspeakers echoed through the block, orders repeated into the cold morning air with the optimism of people who still believe words could end this. Residents watched from behind police lines, wrapped in borrowed coats, holding pets that would not stop shaking. MOVE didn't come out. The pause that followed stretched just long enough for everyone listening to register what silence meant in that moment, for the air to hold its breath before the next sound arrived. And when it did, it wasn't another warning or another appeal. The gunfire tore through the gap where the words had been. Whatever distance the argument had once carried vanished. It collapsed inward, became physical, immediate, faster than the ideas that had brought everyone there could follow. Stuck in the middle was Police Commissioner Gregor Sambor, where he reached the point where every option in front of him felt worse than the last. Being a career police official, Sambor was tasked with enforcing court orders the city had already failed to resolve politically. And by May of 1985, the standoff had outlived negotiations, presence, and credibility. And he was the one expected to end it. Every hour of delay felt like an invitation for the situation to spill outward into the surrounding homes. Should logic narrowed until it could be held in the hand, remove the bunker, end the standoff, and stop the threat. It felt manageable precisely because it avoided asking what may come after, because no one framed it as starting a fire. They believed they were taking apart a structure and forcing an end. Everything beyond that remained unspoken, pushed just far enough outside the plan to make the decisions feel containable. And that was the moment where the path constricted. Once they stepped into it, there would be no clean way out. Above the block, rotors cut into the morning air, the sound arriving before the aircraft itself, low, persistent, and impossible to ignore. From the air, the block still looked ordinary, a neat row of rooftops indistinguishable from 100 others. Nothing about it signaled what had been decided above it. And as the helicopter steadied itself above Osage Avenue, hovering longer than anyone below expected it to, it looked out of place, hanging over a row of identical rooftops that had no reason to be singled out. Then a satchel appeared beneath it, unmistakable once you knew to look for it. There was no countdown, no last appeal. No pause meant to change anyone's mind, because the action was already in motion. When it released, it fell without drama, straight down, a small dark shape slipping into the roofline. The explosion that followed was sharp and contained, almost modest, the kind that sounds smaller than it actually is. Flames took hold almost immediately, faster than anyone on the ground expected, faster than the logic that had justified the decision could keep up. Heat rolled across rooftops. Fire ran through the shared attic spaces. It moved sideways, house to house, ignoring property lines, ignoring plans, using the block itself as fuel. Firefighters stood ready with charged hoses, but orders to wait. All they could do was watch it spread while seconds stretched and then collapsed. On the ground, people recognized their own front windows as the smoke thickened. The fire was no longer contained. Shouts cut through the noise. Names were called and swallowed. Radios crackled with updates that arrived already wrong. And somewhere between the command posts and the street, the certainty that had carried the plan forward finally gave way. Not for clarity, but for loss of control. The fire burned through the night, unchecked, long after any chance to stop it had vanished. And by morning, 11 people were dead. 5 children and 61 homes across 2 city blocks had been erased. Then in the hours that followed, the city slowed itself down as urgency receded as well as the smoke, replaced by procedure, process, and paperwork. Decisions gave way to the documentation. What had burned out of control was gathered up, examined, and made orderly once again. And along with families who never agreed to become part of the confrontation, John Africa, the founder and leader of MOVE, was now dead. Attention shifted from what had happened to how it could be managed. The lawyers arrived, claims were filed, civil settlements quietly replaced answers, and only much later, after the block had been rebuilt and the anger had cooled into something easier to carry, did a formal apology arrive, long after the damage had already settled to the ground. None of this happened in secret. It actually happened on live television. And people across the country watched a city and a belief system collide in real time. They watched the smoke rise, and then when the coverage ended, they went back to their days. I, for one, didn't know this actually happened. Never had a clue until I started doing research for this podcast. But for the people who lived on Osage Avenue, life did not resume. There was no cutaway, no next segment, and no return to normal after the cameras moved on. What unfolded was driven less by malice than by momentum. One belief system that could not bend pressed against an authority that could not tolerate defiance. Neither side stepped aside. Fire did what momentum does when nothing interrupts it, and after the smoke cleared, Osage Avenue was rebuilt and the houses stood again. The street looks quiet now. There's no plaques, no warning signs, just a perfectly normal block where a city once dropped a bomb on itself and then moved on. And then time, it's done what it always does. The footage stopped airing, and the story slipped out of classrooms and headlines. What had unfolded in daylight on camera receded into something people assumed they would have heard about if it truly mattered, like a safety feature that never quite made it into the manual. What happened was visible, documented, and then quietly set aside. Not hidden, just absorbed, filed away, and replaced by whatever came next. And in this time of X, Facebook, and Instagram, no one remembers Osage Avenue. You've been listening to Paul G's Corner. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it. Friends, family, coworkers, strangers on the internet, people you mildly resent, I'm not picky. Also, go and rate and review the show, not because I'm chasing validation, but because the internet lives on maths and it gets weirdly hostile when you don't. And if you want to support what I'm doing, grab the official swag. Head to paulgnewton.com, where I've got shirts and designs that pair nicely with the understanding that most disasters don't start with villains in dark rooms. They start with ordinary people, confident plans, and the assumption that someone else will deal with the consequences. Sounds like modern life to me. So if you ever hear the words, "This is the only option," or "Everything's under control," just do a quick check and make sure you're not the one expected to live next door to it.